Hello, everyone. Just a quick note to let you know we'll get started with our webinar in just 1 minute. We're going to let our attendees go ahead and get settled in for the next 60 seconds or so. Okay, everyone, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. It looks like we've got our attendee list built up. Welcome to today's Altmetric webinar. It is March 7th, 2019, and this week is Academic Book Week. So for that reason, today we'll be talking Altmetrics for books, informing commissioning and data-driven decisions. Speaking today, I'll go ahead and start with myself. I'm your host, Tyler Ruse. I'm the Director of Publisher Solutions at Digital Science. I'm joined by Mike Taylor, who is Head of Metrics Development at Digital Science, and Rebecca Welzenbach, who is a Research Impact Librarian at the University of Michigan Library. What we'll cover today, I'll start with housekeeping, some introductions, and a little bit of background for the story today, and then Mike will follow me and talk about the value of books in the scholarly record. Rebecca will then give her presentation on using Altmetrics and data to make editorial decisions at the University of Michigan Press, and then we'll wrap that all up with a dedicated Q&A session at the end. For housekeeping, first off, for questions, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box, which is part of the GoToWebinar application. We'll cover those at the end in that dedicated session and make sure that our panelists have a chance to respond to those. Let us know if you can't hear or see or have any other technical issues via the chat. We'll see if we can't get those addressed. And just as an FYI, this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all registered attendees at the conclusion. Okay, so a little bit of background and supporting platforms for what we will be talking about today. The first we'll cover will be Altmetric and Altmetrics in general, and then dimensions and publications data will be also brought up. Altmetrics are, generally speaking, indicators of non-traditional attention and engagement with research outputs such as journal articles, monographs, books, and book chapters. This attention and engagement can come from a variety of sources such as social media, news coverage, blog posts, non-journal citations, syllabi, scholarly platforms, and even discussion boards and forums. It's key to point out that Altmetrics complement traditional bibliometric citations. They don't replace them. And Altmetrics can be used alongside traditional research metrics to provide a much earlier indication of impact. They also have the added benefit of being tracked in real time. This means you don't have to wait until a score is calculated and released, or there is a significant period of time for the buildup of citation data. Altmetrics can start accruing immediately after publication. This graphic illustrates those points where you can see attention, such as Twitter mentions, can start within hours of publication, followed closely by news outlets and other social networks. All of this will then is well in advance of traditional citation and indicators and attention and impact. And you can see those later on down the timeline. For Altmetrics, you can again see those within hours where you might not see some traditional citations and other bibliometrics for potentially months and even years. So Altmetric, as part of Digital Science, pick up these mentions as soon as they're online and make them available for view. Here's some statistics that give you an idea of the number of online mentions we track for research, including up almost 250,000 new mentions per day. And Altmetric provides this data to publishers in a couple of different ways and a couple of different visualizations. The first we'll talk about will be the Altmetric badge. Here's an example of that, and it can be deployed on publisher platforms, as in this example, which highlights the attention this monograph has received since publication. You can see that in the lower left corner of the platform page. Again, this data through the badge is updated real time and all of the time. So as this number grows and changes over time, it's dynamically updated where it's deployed, in this case on a publisher platform page. The next application and tool is Altmetric Explorer, which is a comprehensive database and set of analytical tools and reports that gives access and insights to Altmetric data across all of the publications that are being tracked. So that's across publishers, publication types, subject areas, and more. And it really provides a significant amount of capability and tools to look at attention over time by geography and by source. Another platform that we mentioned today is Dimensions, which is another part of digital science. Dimensions is a linked research data platform and brings together comprehensive data sets, including publications, awarded research grants, policy documents, patents, and clinical trials. And it provides analytical tools to explore each of those data sets, as well as the more than 1.1 billion connections between all of them to understand the full picture and impact of research. This includes citation and altmetric data, links from publications to clinical trials, where patents have cited publications, policy documents have mentioned publications, and connections to awarded research grant and funders. In this example, you can see publication details that bring all of the links from this particular publication to all the data sources within Dimensions in one view with some analytical tools and actionable information layered on top. And with that as a backdrop, I'd like to go ahead and turn over the presentation to Mike for his spirited discussion on books in the scholarly record. Following Mike will be Rebecca's review of how this kind of data can inform editorial decisions in book publishing. And then after that, we'll circle back to me so that we can open it up to any questions that have been entered into the Q&A box. And so with that, over to you, Mike. I will go ahead and change you to the presenter.
Thank you, Tyler.
And you should be all set.
Okay, and I trust you can see my full screen presentation now.
Yes.
Cool, excellent. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, depending where you are in the world. My name is Mike Taylor. I'm head of metrics development at Digital Science. I work on Dimensions, not metric. But more importantly, at least for this afternoon, I'm a complete book nerd. The reason I got into academic publishing more years ago than I care to admit is because I loved academic books, and this presentation is bringing together my two professional loves, my professional love of books, my professional love of data and metrics, and my not so professional love of telling stories. I'm involved in the theatre, involved in writing and so on. So I love to use numbers to support stories, to support narratives and the development of narratives. I've discussed this, what I'm going to present today, with many colleagues in different publishing companies around the world, and most recently with a colleague of mine, Dr. Xin Zhu in Oxford, who had some particularly interesting observations about the role of monographs and how that plays in developing thought. So if I wanted to impress you with large quantities of numbers, then I would probably choose biomedicine as a field, or computer science perhaps. But one of the things that I know from publishing is that where monographs and books really pay a critical role is in the humanities and in the social sciences, and also, for that matter, in non-English language fields. So rather than choosing one of these very numerically rich areas, I'm choosing to look at migration studies. An interesting field because it's both human geography in terms of academic field, but also political science. So it's interdisciplinary, it's a social science, it's a humanities, and it doesn't have vast quantities of data. It has, but it has a reasonable amount of data. Sorry, I have just managed to lose my presentation in an effort to get rid of an alert that just popped up there. Bear with me. So we are going to be looking at the role that books, academic books, play in the development of a field, and the different kind of role that they have in telling stories about the development of a field. I'm going to be using Dimensions, the free version, and also the subscribed version, but principally the free version, and Altmetric. So what can we learn about the role of books? So this is Dimensions. This is the free version. You don't even need to log into it. Just go to the URL, app.dimensions.ai. You can choose a field, in this case, human geography on the left-hand side, and you can type in migration and studies to give a list of the 23,463 indexed documents that are in that field and about that topic. And this is my starting point for exploring the data that's in Dimensions and telling some of these stories about the progress of this field. So the first, if you just look at the graph, what you see is a straight line. It's relatively interesting. The field has grown from 800 published in 2010 to 2,500 in 2018. It's a straight line. There's no discernible trends. It's interesting. There's not much you can tell from that other than just regular year-on-year growth. If we use the publications type filter on the left-hand side, we narrow this down to 19,000 research articles. So these are journal articles. And again, it's pretty much a straight line that's going on there. We can see that this is a field that's expanding. It's not expanding at a massive rate, but it seems to be growing a little bit. If we look at book chapters, so these are chapters that appear in collected volumes of books. And again, this is using the free version Dimensions. We can see that there are now two peaks. We've got a peak of chapters in collected works. So these are edited volumes in 2012 and 2013. Then it dies off a little bit. And then it peaks again 2016 to 2017. And it looks as if last year was a bit of a quieter year for chapters, collected works in migration studies. We look at monographs, we see a different curve again. So we're looking at some pretty high numbers here. We're looking at, in 2016, we've got almost 200 monographs in migration studies, in human geography. And again, we've got this two peak pattern. We've got a peak 2012 to 2014. We've got a peak in 2016. Look at research grants. There's a little bit of money that goes into migration studies. It's not high energy physics by any means. We can see that there's also a growth in the amount of money that's going into research. So this is in the subscribed version of Dimensions, not the free version. This gives us an interesting insight into where people are investing in research. Principally in this case, it was coming from Australia and the European Commission. Number of active peaks, active grants peaking in 2015, 2016, almost certainly in response to the two great migration crises that Africa and the Middle East and Europe have experienced, which is the Libyan crisis of a few years ago and more recently the Syrian crisis. Policy documents, which are also indexed in the subscribed version of Dimensions, show are similar two peaks, a peak in 2013, a peak in 2016. So again, if you cast your mind back to the overall graph that we saw for the number of research articles that were being published, we saw no trends at all other than steady growth. In this case, we're seeing distinct periods of growth, of explosions in terms of policy documents and monographs and collected works, which gives us an insight of the different kinds of activity that's going on there. So if I bring these 5 pieces of data together and put them into a little table, we can clearly see that there are two different peaks. There's a period of peaking in about 2012 to 2013, and there's a peak between 2016 and 2018. And we can start thinking about why these peaks happen, why they're not all happening at the same time, why sometimes we're seeing steady growth, why sometimes we see these surges of interest. Well, we know that we have these underlying news stories happening. So for me, the way of thinking about this is to think about what publishing means, the period of time that it takes to work on an article. In this field, it looks as if a typical paper is taking less than a year to write. It's not data intense. Usually, it's usually a qualitative study, for example, issues about food supply for refugees and why that's inspiring people to move countries. Chapters within collected works have a longer research period and longer publishing cycle than articles. Typically, it's about 18 months. It looks as if it's about 18 months in this period. But crucially, chapters aren't constrained by a journal container. When you're thinking about commissioning a series of chapters within an edited work, there is a sense of freedom to explore, develop an area of work. Whereas a monograph, as we know, a monograph takes, even in this field, 2 to 3 years to think about, to plan, to write, to get published, to get edited, and so forth. So a much slower period of response. If we think about those response rates, we can think about it in terms of whereabouts are academics receiving their impetus from, where they're getting the inputs from. In this case, it's probably the policy documents. We have the crisis happening in 2012, 2013, which is leading to an increase of academic work. Policy decision makers, people who have to think about migration on longer term studies, so governments and charities, not-for-profit agencies and so forth. They're writing published policy documents. In some cases, they're making research funding available. And then 2 or 3 years later, academia is responding by an increase in the number of monographs, an increase in the number of collected works. So we see different levels of interaction, different periods of time, different types of argument and work being covered, being developed inside this field. So what happens when we look at Altmetric? So what I've done in this case is I take my query in dimensions, I log in, and I export those DOIs into Altmetric and run some reports. And one of the things that's really a useful tool in Altmetric is the timeline. So I can see those peaks that we see on my graphs from dimensions. We can also see in Altmetric activity as well. So first of all, I wanted to give you a cautionary tale about some of the data. So in this case, when we look at the amount of articles, the percentage of articles, the percentage of chapters, and the percentage of books that get attention on Twitter, we see very startlingly that chapters don't get that much attention on Twitter. The numbers, though, are enormous. So if we look at the raw numbers of people who are sharing tweets about chapters and articles and books about migration, it's very high. And one of the problems with dealing with processing pieces of information like that is that those large numbers do tend to swamp your view of the underlying trends. And it's helpful to use the filtering facility on the Altmetric Explorer timeline tool to look at the individual trends, the trends that are going on underneath. Even if people aren't talking about chapters on Twitter, they are using them in an academic context. So Mendeley, which is a great tool for understanding the future citation rates of publishing output, suggests that chapters, books, and articles are being very highly shared. In fact, that bar, that's 60% for chapters, and that's over 70% for Mendeley for books. Very, very high figures indeed. The articles are pretty much what I would have expected to see. When it comes to citations are a slightly slower process than Mendeley, so those numbers are a little bit further down, but I would expect to see those grow. Again, though, 75% of those books are being cited. That's a very high number indeed. This is a very active and intense area of work. But it's not until we start looking at the individual sources of attention in Altmetric that we start seeing very different trends that are going on here. So first of all, I think it's really important to point out that chapters are very, very quiet. There's a reason for why chapters are quiet, I think, and that's because they're very often chapters that have been put inside books that are on a wider subject area. So for example, if we think about back to the beginning of Altmetrics as a research topic several years ago now, there was a book that was edited by, I think, Cassidy Sugimoto called Beyond Bibliometrics, and my apologies to Cassidy or the editors if I've got that wrong. So Beyond Bibliometrics, and it was very much a book that tried to discuss future trends that were going in data analytics that were going beyond bibliometrics, some of which were altmetrics. But this was very much the first published work where people were exploring ideas of going beyond bibliometrics into things like webometrics, graphmetrics, altmetrics. There are all these different kinds of areas of field that were beginning to emerge at the time. And collected works were a way of exploring, there were essays, exploring some of these future directions. It's not until you get the books, and we've got 2 or 3 books out as well as a Journal of Altmetrics out now, that we're really seeing the development of the field, the solidification of that field, the establishment of that field as being a recognized area of work. And this is exactly what we see in migration studies. We see a field which 10 years ago was not such an important field, a few hundred papers per year, a few thousand now, but we're seeing where those books are being used. So articles are being cited by policymakers, absolutely. So are books at quite high rates. But if you look at that period, that graph for Wikipedia, 14% of monographs in this field have got a link on Wikipedia. And 8% of books in this field are being used as course materials according to the Open Syllabi project. These are very, very high numbers indeed. And one of the things that joins them together is education. It's about study. Wikipedia, we know is being used as an educational tool. It is a jumping off point for explaining a field, for understanding a field. It's used to power those little summaries that Google and Bing and so on produce when you do a search. Having a link in Wikipedia is a very fine thing indeed. These pages are curated by people who are experts in the field, as well as the general public. And when we see that 14% of monographs in this field are being cited on Wikipedia, we know that they are being followed. We know that they are having a broader impact. If we look at the altmetrics across time, again, using the timeline, although I've extracted it just to make for consistency's sake. Here we see articles. Mostly these are quite flat lines. It's only really later, the last couple of years, that we've seen an uptick in the number of articles, research articles, in the field of migration studies that are being shared by the news. This is important information for me because although migration studies as a field has been growing over the past few years with peaks as we've seen in 2012, 2013, as well as 16, 17, and 18, newspapers are clearly a lagging indicator behind the actual academic trends. If we look at chapters very, very quiet in Altmetric, as we've already seen, although it's worthwhile pointing out that even the 8 of those chapters, which is a very small percentage indeed, have got some attention on news. For me, again, here's the monographs. When are the monographs getting attention? And those Wikipedia pages really start to emerge as an important source of information in 2017, 2018. So again, a little bit of a lagging indicator there. But down here, we can see monographs being cited by blogs, by policy documents, going back to those peaks of 2013 to 2014, that earlier peak that we're not seeing in other indicators. So when we pull together all of this data, I can see that we've got a peak in 2012 to 2014. I've added here also the Twitter peaks because those numbers are very large. They're worthwhile pointing out that the general population, the more public population, was sharing academic links, both monographs, chapters, and other forms of information as long ago as 2013. And then later, the 2016, 2017 peak. And here we see absolute strong consistency. We see blogs, we see news, we see Twitter, we see Wikipedia, we see funding, we see policy citations. We see all of this evidence that it's a big news story, a big academic field that's been growing. But all the time, we could have looked back into the time and have established that there was an increasing growth of interest, an increasing amount of academic work and impact all those years ago, 2012, 2013. So I'm going to make some conclusions before I hand over to Rebecca, that the picture that we get from article publication data and article citations is relatively unnuanced. If we are book publishers, we need to be a lot more sophisticated in the way that we use data. We don't want to be drowned in those numbers about articles. Monographs are disproportionately influential in the channels, the key channels that shape societal opinion. In Wikipedia, in education, in news and blogs. Books have a much louder voice than their numbers would suggest. And it's not until we separate them out from articles that we get to see that pattern of interaction between monographs, chapters, and policy documents. Now, I'm being fortunate enough to look at a number of different topics for this presentation before I opted to do migration studies. I looked at forensic genomics, I looked at autonomous driving, post-truth politics, I looked at planetary geology, I looked at prion disease, vegan nutrition and diet, I looked at medicine and augmented reality. And all of these show different textures of patterns. We have to get into the data and to look for that evidence trail before we can pull it out. These are narratives. Each one of these topics is quite individual. When we look at migration studies, we don't see any patents, we don't see any clinical case studies, of course. We do see a lot of policy documents. If we look at something like vegan nutrition and diet, very, very interesting, really massively in the news this year and last year. If you look at the data, there were people thinking about vegan nutrition and the implications for health as long ago as 5 or 6 years ago. So even though it's become important this year and last year, the signs are all there that it was growing importance a few years ago. A monograph is a multi-year effort. It's a thoughtful and nuanced piece of scholarship that has decades of influence. We have to be calm and collected and sophisticated in the way that we use data in book publishing. We can't just look at the numbers and feel sad that we don't get citations as fast as articles. Edited volumes, in particular, very, very interesting because they can be more agile than a journal. They can explore new areas and approaches. They can play a role in unlocking a field, a trailblazing piece of work. So with that, I will come to a conclusion, say thank you very much. I will hand you over to Rebecca.
Hi there, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. I will admit I'm a little bit nervous about this handoff because my GoToWebinar does not seem to be working as it should be. I'm not seeing any controls that I'm gaining here. There we go, it's happening.
Okay, you got it?
Yeah, got it. Thank you, Mike.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic. I was a little bit breathless there myself as well.
Yeah, I was a little nervous, but it looks like I am now sharing my screen. Are folks seeing it?
Yep.
Great, and let me just start my presentation and we'll go. Okay, great. So thrilled that that worked. So Mike just gave us a really fascinating look at sort of what is possible, and it is exciting to me because I think what I'm going to show you now is sort of an example of where we are at the moment, which is in fact a lot less sophisticated. So this is sort of an on-the-ground view of University of Michigan Press and Michigan Publishing and what we've been doing with Altmetric and what we've learned so far. I'm getting some echo. Is everyone muted? Okay, I'll keep going. So I'm the Research Impact Librarian at the University of Michigan, and prior to this role, which I've been in for just over a year, I worked for 8 years in our publishing division here at Michigan on a lot of open access books and journal projects, and as well on new initiatives, including our Altmetric for Publishers pilot. That pilot ran from 2015 to 2017, and we're still using Altmetric today through an institution-wide license at U of M. And as I said, I'll be using Michigan Publishing as a case study to discuss what we've learned in the last few years of using this tool. I want to acknowledge my colleague, Elizabeth Demers, who is our Senior Acquiring Editor for Political and Social Science at the University of Michigan Press. I invited Elizabeth to co-present with me today, but she couldn't do it. But we developed this material together, and as an acquiring editor, she's actually the person in the position to be sort of digging into this data, trying to make decisions with it, whereas I'm a little bit farther removed and sort of lurking and observing to see what we can learn. Our prompt for today was to focus on how Altmetric data can be used by editorial teams to make data-driven decisions. And particularly, we were asked to think about how Altmetric data can be used to reveal emerging trends and new areas of interest. This was an interesting challenge for us because so far our engagement with Altmetric has often been tied really closely to marketing and promotion. We're looking sort of very concretely, book to book. What did we do to promote this book? Can we tell from the Altmetric engagement that was effective or not? And how might that inform what we do for future comparable books? But thinking a little bit more strategically about how it might inform acquisitions was something that we're kind of starting to do, but hadn't really reflected on very much. So this was a great opportunity to do that. I think it's important first to be thinking about what acquisitions editors already do, how they engage with the activity around their books. Historically, of course, sales data is the kind of vital primary metric of success for a monograph. In addition to this, our editors are looking to awards that may be given by relevant scholarly societies, as well as reviews of books appearing in prominent venues. More recently, we're looking at usage data from ebook aggregator platforms like Project Muse, JSTOR, EBSCO, as well as usage data from our own platforms, which we're gathering through Google Analytics. And course adoptions, of course. We're not a textbook publisher, but a lot of our monographs do have use and application in courses, and we're interested to know when and where that's happening. I'll say more about this in a little bit. So in terms of keeping track of how people are engaging with books, Altmetric is another sort of tool in the toolbox, and I think our editors are starting to engage with that. More importantly, and more pertinent to today's topic, though, is how editors keep track of emerging topics and emerging scholars of importance. And this is really the most important and valuable work that acquiring editors do. If they're able to establish a series or a list in an emerging area before a competing press does, or sign a scholar for their first book based on the future success that they anticipate for that person's research, that's really the magic that excellent acquisitions editors bring to their work. So how do they do this now? How have they always done it? They show up as trusted participants and conversants in their discipline. Often this is by attending conferences. They go to panels, they talk to speakers, and they offer consultations and meetings at the press's booth in the exhibit hall. And they're in touch with folks in different ways. They have workshops on campus. They connect with new scholars by way of their relationships with series editors, or if applicable, with journal editors, all sorts of ways. But I think the conference is sort of the perfect example of showing up, being present, and engaging in conversations that are at an early stage where perhaps books or even articles haven't come out on that topic yet. So with all of this in mind, what can Altmetric data contribute to the work of the acquisitions editor? I'm going to speak first to what is not really working, and I think this is sort of a response to Mike's comment. We've been using the data in quite a simplistic way, and it's not terribly effective. So here's what doesn't work. Focusing on the Altmetric engagement data for any given title, and looking at that data and then using it to inform strategy about what to do next. This is kind of what we've been doing when we're using this data to assess marketing efforts, right? You look to see, did we get the book into this venue or that venue, and what was the result? It's a very narrow way of approaching it. When we're thinking about acquisition strategy, this really just doesn't work, and it's because of time, really, more than anything else. One of the key promises of Altmetrics, as we've talked about, is that we can start to gain insight into how work is performing much more quickly than we can when we just had to wait for citations. And for journal articles, there's some evidence that that's true, right? That articles with high Altmetric engagement will, in fact, down the road go on to be more highly cited. But with books, just because of the scope of time for all of this, it just doesn't work the same way. We found that our monographs take a year or more to start accumulating even kind of a moderate amount of meaningful and varied engagement that we can see by way of Altmetric, more than just a handful of tweets. And then, of course, as Mike indicated, books take a long time to acquire and develop and publish. So let's look at something a little bit more concrete. This is a portion of a view from the Altmetric Explorer dashboard. I've called up all of University of Michigan Press books, and I've sorted them from the most recently published on down. You're getting sort of a snippet from the middle here, but what you'll see toward the top is books that were published more recently, and where there's engagement at all, it's a little bit of Twitter activity. As you move down the page, you get to books a little bit older. And where we start to see more interesting, more varied engagement with the books is December 2017. We have to go back, over a year to start to see anything happening. As we go farther back, we see more, but I'm going to focus on right here. Even this, if we drill into it, which I'm not going to do right now, but if we went to see what this engagement looked like and what it was, it's a little bit. It's not a huge amount that you would necessarily want to use to inform business decisions, but even if it were, it's taken over a year to sort of get this amount of information. And if we were to take it, say the engagement on the book Gendered Vulnerability over on the right side of the screen, and make a decision about a new book on political science and gender, that would take another 2 or 3 years to sort of identify that author, that title, acquire and publish that book. So it's too long if we focus on taking data from one book and using it to inform the next book. As Elizabeth pointed out to me, especially in political science, a book that is really timely right now and of the moment, getting a lot of attention and engagement is probably not going to be timely 2 or 3 years from now. So we need to be looking not just book to book, but at conversations happening beyond and between books. Of course, this is what editors do all the time in their daily lives, but how to do it in the space of altmetric data is something for us to explore further, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So what does seem to be working? Interestingly, Altmetric has shown us a lot about which books are somewhat timeless, which have enduring value over time. It's given us a lot of useful insights into our deep backlist titles, which I think was a surprise and often surprises folks when I show them Altmetric for the first time. It hasn't occurred to them that a book from the 80s might have attention and engagement that we can look at now. The bit of data that is especially interesting to our acquiring editors is where books show up on syllabi. This gives them important information about books that have been adopted for use in courses. So let's look at another view of the Altmetric Explorer dashboard. In this case, I've pulled up all of the University of Michigan Press titles, books, and I've sorted them by how many syllabus mentions they have. And there are a few things that I want to point out here that are interesting. First of all, if you can see the publication dates, that is pretty interesting. A lot of books from the 80s, from the 90s, even some from the 50s and 60s. Those happen to mostly be translations of classical texts. We did not publish the Aeneid the first time, but we seem to have an edition that's quite popular. The other thing that I would point out, and I think this is a little bit of an echo of what Mike was saying about the disproportionate impact of books and monographs in particular areas, is the books that have the most syllabus mentions, that seem to have been the most widely adopted in courses, are very often show quite little engagement in other spaces. They're not books that have had active engagement on social media or necessarily in the news, and yet they're widely used in courses. That would have been easy for us to miss with these books that are 15, 20 years old or more, and that we're just not actively aware of because they're not in the news or sort of in the media right now. So when we see this kind of information, this kind of feedback, it lets us know perhaps, this book needs a new edition or an update. Maybe we should bring back that author to do something new, or maybe it's just a topic that is still very much of interest. I will say the one at the top in the middle, simulacra and simulation, we've always known that this is one of our most sort of perennial, widely used texts in the classroom. But one that was a bit of a surprise to us is on the left, 3 down, Bad Boys. This is a book about systemic racism in schools. Unfortunately, this book has remained really relevant, but perhaps this topic is due for an update. That's something for us to think about. Again, because of the time here, I can't say, and we've done it. We've published a new book in this area that we're not there yet, but that book in particular, I would say, is one that has really captured our attention as a space where perhaps we ought to be doing something new. So I've talked a bit about what didn't work for us and where we are seeing some value from Altmetric data, but I want to now say a word about where I think we have a lot of untapped potential that we haven't even started to explore yet. And this is, again, piggybacking on what Mike was talking about, the need for a really sophisticated approach to engaging with this data. We have access to the whole Altmetric Explorer database, what Altmetric has tracked in terms of engagement with, millions of publications. But so far, we've taken a very narrow approach. I think as a publisher, as we were launching this pilot, we were very, very focused on deploying Altmetric tracking and Altmetric badges on our own books, and sort of lost sight of looking beyond that. We've been tracking what can we see about engagement with a book that we published in the last year, in the last 5 years, and have forgotten to make use of all the rich data that's there beyond our own publications. So what I'm going to show you here is not nearly as nuanced as what Mike was showing you, but just as a very rough example, here I've searched the full Altmetric database just for research outputs that match a keyword search for political science, nothing even more precise than that, which of course would be desirable. But if I sort them by Altmetric attention score, you know, we see research coming out in recent years that's gotten a lot of engagement, and we can start to see emerging themes, a lot to do with political polarization, a lot to do with gender. I think our editor is aware of those trends, but she'd be able to be more, you know, even more precise in her search here to see what's coming. So I think there are opportunities here for us to see, even though books, you know, accrue attention more slowly and take longer to come out, we could be using this tool more creatively to see what's emerging in spaces that perhaps do emerge more rapidly, and to find those topics, those themes, or even those authors who are engaging in new spaces that our editors might want to be aware of. So as I wrap up my time here, I just want to mention another resource that I think is a useful one. I saw earlier this week that a report came out on the joint pilot between Altmetric and the Association of University Presses. And what that's about is a handful of university presses tested out Altmetric and summarized their experiences there. The University of Michigan Press was not part of that pilot, mainly because we were already doing our own pilot at that time. But I looked over the key sort of recommendations and outcomes from that report, and I've just pasted them verbatim here. And they really aligned with our experience, particularly the value for Altmetrics in looking for interest in backlist titles, which we didn't expect, the importance of particular types of data, specifically mentions in syllabi, the importance of being really, really aware of the difference between how quickly journal articles come out and accrue attention versus the length of time that it takes both for books to be developed and also to get really rich engagement, were all things that very much aligned with our experience. So if you're interested in how Altmetric works for books, I'd encourage you to spend some time with that report, and I intend to read it a little more closely as well myself. But to wrap up sort of my takeaways here, I think what we've learned in terms of Altmetric for engagement, sorry, I hope you're not getting my alert there. Altmetric data can accumulate more quickly than citations, and yet for books, it still comes pretty slowly, and books take a long time to publish. So if we focus too much on books we published before, guiding us into the future for books we might want to publish later, it's not terribly helpful. It's a bit too slow. That being said, Altmetric data can tell us a lot about the endurance of particular titles and topics. So actually, instead of looking for hot trends, looking at what persists over time has been a really interesting strategy for us to think about. And then finally, I think there's a huge amount of value to be mined well beyond the data about just the books that we have published ourselves. We could be doing a lot more with Altmetric Explorer, and I think as Mike pointed out with Dimensions, to supplement the work that acquiring editors already do to engage in conversations around emerging trends and emerging scholars. But we haven't explored that systematically yet. We're not skilled users there yet. So I think there's a lot of untapped potential. And that is really what we've learned so far. So I'm going to see if I can change presenters back over to Tyler, and we can have some conversation.
Sounds great. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, just go ahead and change me back to being the presenter.
Yeah, I am trying.
Excellent. And in the meantime, if anybody does have any questions, feel free to type those into the Q&A box so that we can ask those during this reserved time for questions.
Yeah, I apologize, Tyler. I'm having some trouble changing. The panel is just not responding at all to my clicking on it. I'm not sure what is going on. I'm sorry about that.
Nope. No problem at all. We will charge forth. So I'll go ahead and start reading some of the questions out of the Q&A box for each of the panelists. And so if you could just answer those, we don't need to back them up with any presentations or anything like that. The first question I've got in is actually for Mike. And it is simply that you had talked about the amount of data that might be available for other research categories beyond migration studies. Do you have a sense of whether that sort of massive amount of data really negatively or positively impacts the type of analysis you did? All right, and I don't hear Mike.
Mike,
there we go, Mike.
Pressed the right button. Mike did not press the right button. Somebody somewhere has been unmuted. It wasn't me. Okay, so I think it's a really good question. When we deal with journal metrics, when we deal with article metrics, we have this luxury of dealing with tens of thousands of related articles. It is, you know, numbers, buckets of numbers, which we can talk about, and we don't have that luxury with monographs. It has to be a more sophisticated, more painstaking approach to the numbers. You do have to get familiar with what you're looking at and the meaning of those individual things. And again, just to repeat my point, I made a warning about looking just at the timeline with the Twitter present, because if you do that, the number of tweets in this particular field will dominate the rest of the data. And actually, it's when you unlook at that, you look at the policy documents and the syllabi and the other things, you really get a sense of the richness of the different trends that are going on underneath. Now, when I chose to look at migratory studies, I said that I looked at about a dozen other fields as well. And the interesting thing is that they all show these very lumpy trends going on underneath the surface. They're not consistently related to the articles. You do get these different trends that are going on, but importantly, they're all different. They're quite unique. Each one of those is quite unique. So you see these different flows of information. It was interesting to me, for example, when I looked at autonomous driving, you obviously have patents, patent data in autonomous driving. You don't get in migration. You do, however, get policy documents. There are issues about law and autonomous driving and safety and autonomous driving, which have only really started coming into the forefront in the last year or two. So in this case, policy was very much of a lagging indicator rather than a leading indicator. In migration studies, it appears to be a leading indicator. So you have to take each one of your topics, you have to investigate it in the same way that you do any other investigation. You have to be critical of the data, you have to engage with the data, you have to think about what you're looking for, test those hypotheses, really think about what they're doing here. What I'm not suggesting, what I'm not saying is that you can use either one of these tools, or Google for that matter, and just plug a term in there and hope to get a number back to tell you how hot a subject is. Hotness is just not that simple. It is a complex idea, a complex interaction of different kinds of academics, different fields thinking about things at different speeds and different places. Books, chapters, collected works, monographs, they all have their role to play in the development of a field.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next question. This one's for Rebecca, fairly straightforward, I think. But in the Altmetric Explorer, do you get to see titles from across all publishers or just your own titles?
It's across all publishers. So that's where there's the opportunity, I think, to explore who's engaging with other articles published by others or other books published by others.
Great.
It would have to be something that Altmetric is capable of tracking, which I think in the book space can be a little more challenging because they're like pretty much any article with a DOI registered with Crossref, Altmetric will be aware of. So you can have a pretty good, you can make a good assumption that the vast majority of published scholarly journal articles are going to show up in Altmetric. That's not necessarily true for books. Book publishers likely will have had to make a bit more of an effort to make their books visible to Altmetric, either by registering a DOI, which isn't necessarily standard practice yet, or in some other way. So yes, you can see beyond just your own publications, but it has to be a work that Altmetric is aware of. And for books, I would say at this time, that's probably a lot more dicey than for articles.
Great, thank you very much. Excellent. Okay, another question. We'll put this out to both panelists, but there's a question in wondering if there is comparative data on open access versus closed access books and chapters. Mike, how about you start?
Sure. Okay, so I haven't done a specific analysis on this. The issue of open access chapters and open access monographs is a slowly growing one. In fact, I'm working with a group of people on a white paper that is looking at trends in open access monographs. So I think probably this time next year or later this year, we'll be able to have a webinar which is specifically dedicated to that subject. I don't have much to say at the moment. The numbers are very small, but they are growing, and they're actually growing depending on whereabouts you're looking at, which topic you're looking at. The number of open access monographs is growing at quite a good rate, but it is very geographically dependent. And of course, we've got all the issues about Plan S and the impact that will have on open access publishing to think about as well. So it's very hard. I would be trying to make a prediction if I said anything strong about open access chapters and monographs at the moment. I would rather wait 6 months and report.
I can just offer the very little anecdotal version of our experience here at University of Michigan. We have a good number of open access monographs here, so we're able to see quite a bit of both. But again, the share of the world of scholarly literature, it's absolutely tiny. What is ours? But I would say, of course, we see huge differences between closed access books and open access in terms of actual usage, because folks can discover an open access book via Google and just go to it and read it. I would say that we've seen less of a dramatic difference between closed and open in terms of Altmetric engagement. And that may well be because often the type of engagement that we're seeing is not getting into the content of the book. It's somebody announcing that their new book is out on Twitter and that getting retweeted a bunch of times, that sort of thing. Promotional kinds of stuff that is applied just as well to open or closed access books. So I would say, I think one area where there is a difference is in the news. It's perhaps easier for them or works better for them to point to a book that is open than one that's closed. But that I haven't systematically investigated that. So it's all quite anecdotal. But I'd say we're seeing a greater disparity between open and closed when we look at actual, usage views of the book itself, as opposed to links to it, which is what Altmetric tracks.
Great, thanks. Next question is also for you, Rebecca. It is wondering if you've seen any connection between Altmetric data and impact to sales in terms of your using sales data as an indicator for editorial acquisition.
I think it's way too early to say, and just that the numbers are too small to be very significant. The studies that we've done trying to sort of, this is beyond Altmetric now, but to assess sort of, the use and the reach of our books suggest, and Mike alluded to this too, that just with humanities monographs, there are very few patterns. Everything is sort of spiky and every book has its own story. So it's hard to say. I don't think I could make any claims about it. I think that's as far as I can go, I think. Okay,
thank you very much. Okay, next question for Mike. It is related to the recent news, the University of California system withdrawing from their Elsevier journal subscriptions. I'm wondering if that's an emerging opportunity in an area for Altmetric to gain more traction in academia.
Well, that's not a question I'd have anticipated. That's an interesting one. I don't even know how to go about thinking about that. Yeah, I mean, somebody somewhere out there is going to be using the data to look at the effects of that. It is somewhat interesting. We are nearly 10 years into Altmetric, or the field of Altmetric, even if it wasn't called that 10 years ago. So we can say some absolutely certain things. We can say that if you're sharing a link to a volume, then you're going to be driving traffic to that site. And if you are looking at that site, we also know that if it's available to access, people will be downloading it. So that we know that there is a causative link that drives usage, that drives engagement, that drives readership from social metrics. This isn't something that we need to question. There's plenty of research going back many years now that shows this. The question of whether it has an effect, whether there is going to be a downturn perhaps towards Elsevier journals, or whether there is going to be an uptick towards open access, is really interesting. And of course, Altmetric is in the great position that we have more or less real-time data in this. So although I haven't done any work in this, I hope very much that somebody is doing that work. I have got a number of real-time studies running at the moment, but sadly not in that area, not for that publisher.
Gotcha. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the sort of impromptu question and answer there.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. If I can just pop back to 2 questions before, because we had this issue here of the metadata that's available in the DOIs and the identifiers for scholarly books. So depending on how you define the world of scholarly books, there's at least 5 million, possibly a maximum of 10 or even 30 million if you're very, very generous, in terms of published scholarly books. And yet we only have about 1 million books with the DOI. The difference that makes is quite exceptional, not just to Dimension, not just to Altmetric, but in terms of how the scholarly infrastructure connects. If you have a DOI out there, if you have author data, if you have an introduction or an abstract to that book and a title and the publisher and a pub date, it means that all of these systems that use that metadata are able to see, to report, to analyze, to track the impact of those books. When we think about a book which just has got an ISBN, it's very, very hard to track, to follow it, to understand its impact. Giving a DOI, a very cheap thing to do, very easy thing to do nowadays, opens up that metadata and makes it alive. So I would urge everyone who runs a book list to produce DOIs, even for their backlist. It would be a great thing to do.
I think that's a great point, Mike. Metadata is really important here in terms of all of the things we've been talking about today, and the ability to analyze and track and see attention and activity. It's a very good point. And with that, we're just a couple of minutes left, and we have run through our list of questions. So I think that we'll go ahead and wrap up. We really appreciate everybody's time today and attention, and hope that you learned some things, and we'll walk away with understanding a little bit more about how Altmetrics and other types of data can really support book publishing. So thank you very much, and everyone have a great day.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you.